It was a rare thing for St. Mildred's to wake beneath a blanket of snow. The little village, perched somewhere between the rolling downs and the somnolent woods of Eastshire, was used to frost and fog, but proper snow, the kind that softened every hedge and muted every sound, came but once in a blue moon. And so, when it arrived that December, the villagers were determined to celebrate it in the grandest fashion possible. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Pembroke, had suggested a snow festival, a good, wholesome community affair, as she put it. There would be a snow sculpture competition on the green, stalls selling homemade toffee and mince pies, and, to finish, a lantern-lit procession to the frozen pond. The event promised simple pleasures, the sort that warmed even the most curmudgeonly heart. Miss Jane Marple, who had accepted the vicar's wife's invitation out of politeness rather than enthusiasm, stood quietly near the edge of the green, wrapped in her old tweed coat. Her breath came out in small, silvery puffs, and her knitting needles clicked softly beneath her muffler as she observed the lively scene. She did not much care for crowds, nor for the damp cold that crept into one's bones, but she found the sight of her neighbors, so full of excitement and goodwill, rather endearing. The butcher's wife, Mrs. Hargreaves, was arranging candied apples with militaristic precision. Young Arthur Pike, the schoolmaster's son, was building an elaborate snow dragon, and at the center of it all, bustling about in a fur-collared coat far too grand for the occasion, was Mrs. Lydia Carroway. "Trust Lydia to make herself the center of attention," murmured Mrs. Hartnell, who stood beside Miss Marple, blowing on her gloved fingers. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "She does have a talent for it," she said mildly. Lydia Carroway had moved to St. Mildred's only 6 months before, taking possession of the old mill house on the outskirts of the village. She was strikingly beautiful in a way that suggested careful maintenance, rather than nature's gift. Her blonde hair a little too perfect, her smile a touch too polished. Rumor held that she was a widow of considerable means, though opinions varied as to how her late husband had acquired his fortune, and, indeed, how he had lost it. "Mark my words," Mrs. Hartnell continued, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "She's after Colonel Harcourt, the way she carries on, fluttering her lashes like some debutante. It's shameful at her age." Miss Marple did not respond. She had known the Colonel since before the Great War, and she doubted he was easily fluttered. Still, she noticed how he stood near Mrs. Carroway now, his posture uncharacteristically straight, his usually stern face softened by what might have been admiration, or perhaps nostalgia. The festival was in full swing by mid-afternoon. Snowmen stood guard along the green, children darted to and fro in squeals of delight, and the vicar, who had taken charge of the judging, walked about with a clipboard, looking both earnest and slightly bewildered. "Miss Marple," cried Mrs. Pembroke, bustling over with the air of a woman managing a small kingdom, "you must come and see Mr. Rawlins's sculpture. It's supposed to be St. George, though to my eye it looks rather more like a sheepdog." Miss Marple chuckled softly, but did not move. She was watching Lydia Carroway again, who had just accepted a cup of hot punch from a young man in a brown overcoat. Handsome, but with that restless air Miss Marple had come to associate with people who did not quite belong anywhere. "That'll be Simon Darnley," said Mrs. Hartnell knowingly. "Her cousin, so she says, though if you ask me, there's something not quite cousinly about the way he looks at her." "Family relations can be quite complicated," Miss Marple murmured. Before Mrs. Hartnell could reply, a sharp cry cut through the cheerful noise of the crowd. It came from near the bandstand, where the Colonel and Mrs. Carroway had been speaking. Heads turned. The laughter faded into an uneasy silence. "Good heavens," gasped Mrs. Pembroke. "What on earth?" Colonel Harcourt was kneeling in the snow, his gloved hands pressed to his head. At his feet lay Lydia Carroway, her pale hair spread like a halo upon the white ground. Someone shrieked, and a few of the younger villagers rushed forward. "Fetch Dr. Latham," shouted the vicar. But even as the village doctor pushed through the gathering crowd, Miss Marple could tell, by that stillness which no living person ever quite manages, that Lydia Carroway was beyond help. The frost fair ended in confusion and whispers. The constable arrived from the next village over, young, red-cheeked, and nervous, and the doctor confirmed what Miss Marple already knew. Mrs. Carroway was dead. Poison, he suspected, though the details would have to wait for proper examination. The colonel, still pale and trembling, insisted he had only offered her some of the punch. She took one sip, Miss Marple, just one sip, and then collapsed, my dear lady. She was speaking quite cheerfully only a moment before. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his arm. "I know, Colonel. Try not to distress yourself further." But her eyes, as mild and blue as the winter sky, swept over the little gathering, the faces anxious, curious, fearful, and there, half hidden behind the crowd, she noticed Simon Darnley watching with a strange expression. Not grief exactly, something closer to calculation. That evening, as darkness fell over St. Mildred's, and the lanterns from the festival still flickered like uneasy ghosts, Miss Marple sat by her hearth, the ticking clock marking the silence. Poison at a snow festival, a widow of questionable fortune, a cousin who was not quite a cousin. It was, she reflected, exactly the sort of thing one might expect in a place where everyone fancied they knew everyone else, and where, invariably, they knew far less than they thought. The morning after the snow festival dawned pale and brittle, the kind of cold that turned every breath to crystal. The church bells tolled 8:30, a solemn reminder that even in the most peaceful of villages, life or death did not pause for the weather. By 9 o'clock, all of St. Mildred's was humming with gossip. The murder, or tragic accident, as the vicar still insisted on calling it, had spread like wildfire through the cottages, the post office, and Mrs. Hargreaves's butcher shop. Miss Marple, returning from a quiet errand at the grocer's, could hear the murmurs before she even reached the high street. It was poison. That's what Dr. Latham said. "Right in the punch," declared Mrs. Hartnell to an audience of 2, her breath fogging the window of the post office as she spoke. "And who was serving the punch, may I remind you? Colonel Harcourt himself." "Nonsense," retorted Mr. Denby, the postmaster, whose spectacles were perpetually sliding down his nose. "The colonel may be many things, cantankerous, certainly. But a poisoner? Never. More likely that flashy cousin of hers did it, the one who calls himself Simon Darnley, always hanging about the mill house, and no one knows where he came from." "America, I heard," said Mrs. Webb, the seamstress, "or somewhere equally dreadful." "Spain," corrected Mrs. Hartnell, "and we all know what sort of things go on there." Miss Marple entered the post office just as Mrs. Hartnell turned to add, "Mark my words, Jane, it'll all come out soon enough. Wickedness has a way of showing itself, just like a stain through thin cloth." "Indeed it does," said Miss Marple mildly, unwrapping her muffler, "though I do find that one must be careful before scrubbing too vigorously. One might remove the cloth altogether." Mrs. Hartnell blinked, unsure whether she had been agreed with or gently scolded, and Miss Marple smiled her polite, unreadable smile. By midday, the talk had reached fever pitch. The vicar and Constable Simmons were doing their best to preserve order, but St. Mildred's was not the sort of place to keep secrets well, Everyone knew who had been standing near the punch bowl. Everyone had an opinion on who had most to gain by Mrs. Carroway's untimely demise. At the Blue Boar Inn, the regulars gathered in the snug, their whispers competing with the crackle of the fire. "She was a nasty piece of work, that one," muttered Mr. Toller the blacksmith over his pint. "Flirting with every man in sight, and owing half the tradesmen money, I shouldn't wonder. Debts, you think?" asked his companion, Mr. Hargreaves. Then maybe that cousin, Darnley, had reason enough, if she was about to cut him off, say, or threaten to expose him. From his corner table, the innkeeper's wife, Mrs. Pike, leaned closer to her husband. "I heard from Clara Latham that the doctor found traces of laudanum in her cup. Laudanum, where would a lady like that get such a thing?" "Easily enough," said Miss Marple, who had entered quietly and now stood by the fire, warming her hands. "Laudanum is an old-fashioned medicine. Many households keep it, though few remember exactly what it's capable of." The room fell silent for a moment, every face turning toward her. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," said Mr. Toller, "but you seem to know more than the constable." "Oh, dear me, no," she replied, shaking her head. "I know nothing of importance, only that human nature is much the same wherever one finds it, whether in St. Mildred's or St. Mary Mead. People act from much the same motives, you see. Fear, greed, love, jealousy. Only the settings differ." There was a murmur of agreement, half respectful, half uneasy. Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but there was something in her manner that made even the most talkative villagers pause before offering further speculation. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked home along the narrow lane that wound past the mill house. Snow still clung to the hedges, and smoke rose faintly from the house's tall chimneys. The place looked peaceful enough, but there was a melancholy air about it, as though the very bricks were in mourning. Constable Simmons stood at the gate, his notebook in hand, looking decidedly out of his depth. "Ah, good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said, touching his cap. "Terrible business, this. Never had a proper murder in St. Mildred's before. The inspector's coming from Eastbourne tomorrow, thank heavens." "Have you discovered anything interesting, my dear?" she asked kindly. "Nothing solid," he admitted. "Just bits and pieces. The punch bowl's been taken for testing, and Dr. Latham says she died within minutes, so it must have been fast-acting. But the colonel swears he only poured from the same bowl everyone else drank from. No one else fell ill." Miss Marple nodded. "How curious. A poison that affects only one person, though shared by many. That suggests a rather personal touch." Simmons frowned. "Personal, ma'am?" "Oh, yes," she said softly. "Poison is seldom impersonal. It requires proximity, planning, and a certain intimacy of knowledge. You must know your victim's habits well enough to predict what they'll eat or drink. That, I always think, limits the field of suspects." The constable scribbled something in his notebook, looking thoughtful. "You ought to be in the police yourself, Miss Marple." "Goodness, no," she said with a small laugh. "I should make a very poor constable. I've never cared for rules. But I do find people quite fascinating." As she turned to leave, she noticed Simon Darnley standing at an upstairs window, watching her. When their eyes met, he stepped back abruptly, as though he hadn't meant to be seen. Yuppie. By evening, the snow had begun to fall again. Lightly, silently, as if nature wished to bury the village's unease under a fresh white shroud. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting on her lap, thinking over what she had heard that day. She had known too many villages, too many tragedies, to be surprised by the pettiness and speculation that followed a sudden death. Yet something about this case troubled her more than most. Lydia Carroway had not been well liked, true, but she had been noticed, the kind of woman whose presence rippled through a place, unsettling the still waters. People like that often inspired fascination and resentment. Her cousin, the charming and evasive Mr. Darnley, the dignified but visibly shaken Colonel Harcourt, Mrs. Pembroke, who had been near the punch bowl fussing about with decorations, even Dr. Latham himself, whose wife had once been heard saying Lydia Carroway was altogether too familiar with her husband. Each in their own way had reason enough for discomfort, and yet, Miss Marple reflected, real wickedness often came from the most unexpected corners, sometimes even from those who seemed the least capable of it. She lifted her teacup, her pale blue eyes distant. It was, she thought, like one of her Aunt Helen's jigsaw puzzles. So many bright pieces scattered across the table, none fitting neatly together, yet she could already see the edges forming. In time, the picture would be clear. The following morning brought a peculiar hush over St. Mildred's. The snow had hardened to a crusty sheen, and the sound of footsteps rang sharp against the frozen ground. Curtains twitched, kettles hissed, and yet a nervous stillness hung in the air. Murder, Miss Marple thought as she drew her curtains aside, always seemed to rob a village of its innocence more thoroughly than any crime committed elsewhere. The inspector from Eastbourne arrived just before noon. Inspector Craddock, a solid man of middle years with a kind expression and an untidy moustache, was no stranger to Miss Marple, having once or twice consulted her on cases that defied straightforward logic. He was practical, fair-minded, and faintly skeptical of old ladies' instincts, though he had learned not to dismiss them outright. Constable Simmons met him at the vicarage gate and led him straight to the mill house where Lydia Carroway's body had been laid in the drawing-room, the curtains drawn and the fire extinguished. The scene was solemn, though the small village parlor lent an air of domesticity that made the death seem doubly cruel. Miss Marple, having been invited by Mrs. Pembroke to lend moral support, arrived soon after, carrying a small basket of flowers. The police did not protest. Miss Marple had a way of being everywhere she was least expected, yet somehow perfectly appropriate. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said Inspector Craddock, with a faintly rueful smile. "I had a feeling you might turn up." "One should always pay one's respects," she replied gently, setting down the flowers, particularly when tragedy strikes one's own village. Craddock nodded, consulting his notebook. "Dr. Latham confirms poison, laudanum and something else, possibly strychnine. The combination would be quick and unpleasant. She couldn't have lasted more than a minute." "How dreadful," murmured Mrs. Pembroke, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. "The laudanum must have been added to her drink," Craddock continued. "But the curious thing is, no one else who drank from that bowl was affected, so either her cup was tampered with, or she carried the poison herself." Miss Marple's knitting needles, she had brought them, as always, in her handbag, clicked quietly. "You think she meant to take her own life, Inspector?" "It's possible," said Craddock. "A case of mistaken dosage, perhaps." Miss Marple's head tilted slightly. "Yes, possible, but not very likely, don't you think? A woman like Mrs. Carroway, beautiful, admired, fond of comfort, hardly the sort to choose the snow and a village festival for her final act. No, vanity would have prevented that." Craddock smiled faintly. "You speak as though you knew her well." "Oh dear, not at all," Miss Marple replied. "But one observes things, Inspector. I have known her type before." The questioning began in earnest that afternoon. The villagers, unused to such scrutiny, fluttered between indignation and self-importance. Colonel Harcourt was called first. His complexion was pale beneath his military tan, and his hands trembled as he recounted the events. "She was standing by the punch bowl," he said, talking about the sculpture competition. "I poured her a cup, just as I did for Mrs. Pembroke a few minutes earlier. I turned away to greet the vicar, and when I looked back, she was on the ground." "Did you see anyone else approach the bowl?" asked Craddock. "No one in particular. There were dozens of people moving about. Children, ladies with trays. It was a crowd, Inspector. Anyone might have done it." Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the window, observed the colonel's hands twisting his hat brim. There was guilt there, not necessarily of murder, but of something. When Simon Darnley was brought in, he appeared calm, though there was a slight flush to his cheeks. "I told you already," he said. "Lydia was my cousin. She'd been unwell for weeks. Sleeplessness, nerves, that sort of thing. I suppose it's possible she took something herself. I tried to persuade her to see a specialist." "Did you know she used laudanum?" Craddock asked. He hesitated. "Yes. She kept a small bottle in her dressing table. She said it helped her rest." "And where were you during the festival?" "With the children, building that ridiculous snow dragon," Darnley replied. "Ask half the village. They'll tell you." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And afterward?" she asked mildly. "You were seen near the refreshment table." Darnley's eyes flicked toward her, wary. "I brought her a cup of punch. I handed it to her, yes, but the colonel was there, too. You can't possibly think—" "Oh, no," said Miss Marple sweetly. "I think nothing at all. But I do remember once in St. Mary Mead, a young man who poured cider for a lady at a garden party, and quite unintentionally used the wrong jug. The result was most distressing." Darnley gave a tight smile. "Unintentional mistakes can happen, of course." "Indeed they can," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes very blue and very calm. By evening, most of the key witnesses had been interviewed. Dr. Latham had confirmed the presence of laudanum in the deceased's system, and something else yet unidentified. The punch bowl, examined by the chemist, contained no trace of either. "That settles it," said Constable Simmons over tea in the vicarage kitchen. "The poison wasn't in the punch. It was in the cup." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "A cup that someone must have filled separately, perhaps after the others had gone." Mrs. Pembroke gasped. "You don't mean the colonel?" "Oh, surely not. Colonel Harcourt is a proud man," Miss Marple said. "But he is not, I think, a cruel one. Still, pride has driven many to foolish acts." "What of Simon Darnley?" asked Craddock. "There's talk he was in debt. Gambling, perhaps. If she refused him money, well, that's motive enough." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Yes, but motive alone is never quite sufficient, is it? One must also consider opportunity and temperament. Some people are simply not built for murder, no matter how pressing the temptation." The room fell silent for a moment, the clock ticking softly on the mantelpiece. "I wonder," Miss Marple continued, "did anyone notice what became of Mrs. Carroway's handbag? She had it with her at the festival. People like her are never without one. It's rather like armor." Mrs. Pembroke frowned. "Now you mention it, I don't recall seeing it afterward." Inspector Craddock made a note. "We'll have a search conducted in the morning." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I shouldn't be surprised if that little bag proves most enlightening." The snow began again as Miss Marple made her way home, her boots crunching softly on the frozen lane. Lights glowed in cottage windows, and faint strains of carol practice drifted from the church hall. To an outsider, the village would have seemed perfectly peaceful, untouched by evil, but Miss Marple knew better. Evil seldom announced itself with noise and drama. It crept in quietly, disguised in the manners of everyday life. She paused at the gate of her cottage, glancing once more toward the distant outline of the mill house. Somewhere in that elegant, melancholy dwelling, she felt sure, lay the key, not only to Mrs. Carroway's death, but to something older, deeper. Inside, she set down her knitting bag and took up her teapot, which had been waiting on the hearth. As she poured the steaming liquid, she murmured softly to herself, laudanum in her drink, strychnine in her blood, and a vanished handbag. Such untidiness would have distressed Aunt Helen very much indeed. Her eyes twinkled faintly, though her expression was grave. It was early days yet, and people were saying many foolish things, but Jane Marple had already begun to see faint outlines forming in the snowy puzzle before her, the subtle marks of deceit, the invisible footprints of guilt, and she knew, with that quiet certainty that came only from long experience, that the truth, however coldly buried, would not stay hidden for long. Inspector Craddock was an early riser, and by the time most of St. Mildred's was stirring from sleep, he was already seated in the vicarage study with Constable Simmons and a pot of overbrewed tea. A small fire crackled half-heartedly in the grate. On the table before them lay the morning's prize discovery, Lydia Carroway's missing handbag. It had been found by a milkman on the edge of the green, half buried beneath a drift of snow. Its clasp was broken, the contents damp but largely intact. A silver compact, a lace handkerchief, a small notebook, and a tiny brown vial with an ornate stopper. The label, nearly washed away, still bore a faint word in curling script. Laudanum. Craddock tapped the bottle with the end of his pencil. This, Simmons, is what we call a clue. Whether it incriminates or exonerates, we shall see. Simmons looked nervous. Begging your pardon, sir, but if that's hers, wouldn't that suggest, well, suicide? Craddock grunted. Not necessarily. It might just as easily have been planted. People don't usually toss away a handbag full of evidence unless they want someone to find it. At that moment, a soft knock came from the door. Miss Marple entered, neat as a pin, a small sprig of holly in her lapel, and a look of mild curiosity in her eyes. "I hope I'm not intruding, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "Mrs. Pembroke mentioned you had found something of Mrs. Carroway's, and I thought you might allow me a peep. I have such a weakness for ladies' accessories." Craddock smiled despite himself. "You've better timing than the police photographer, Miss Marple. Have a look." She examined the bag with delicate fingers, careful not to disturb the damp papers. Ah, how typical. A lovely design, quite modern but impractical for country wear. And this little bottle? She turned it thoughtfully toward the light. Yes, this is indeed laudanum. But see here, the stopper doesn't match the bottle. It's from another container altogether. Rather careless, don't you think? Careless, or deliberate, Craddock said. Precisely, Miss Marple agreed, eyes twinkling. A lady like Mrs. Carroway might have been careless in love or conversation, perhaps, but never in presentation. If she intended to take her own life, she would have done it privately and gracefully, not with mismatched glassware. Craddock sighed. "You're not making my life any easier, Miss Marple." "I never do, Inspector," she said serenely. By midday, the inspector's suspicions had narrowed. Colonel Harcourt, whose nervous manner had not improved under questioning, seemed the most obvious suspect. He had poured the punch. He had a long acquaintance with the victim, and his manner suggested a man burdened by more than grief. "He's hiding something," Craddock muttered as they trudged through the snow toward Harcourt Lodge. Miss Marple, who accompanied him purely out of neighborly concern, gave a small hum of agreement. "Oh, yes, But what he hides may not be murder, Inspector. Many respectable men hide foolishness. It's quite a common affliction. Colonel Harcourt received them stiffly in his study, his loyal spaniel at his feet. The fire burned low, casting a wan light upon the rows of medals and faded photographs. "I've told you all I know," he said impatiently. "Lydia was a friend, nothing more. I offered her a cup of punch, and within minutes she was dead. It's a nightmare I'd give anything to forget. Yet you and Mrs. Carroway were seen together rather frequently," Craddock noted. "Walks along the river, evenings at the club. People talk." The colonel's face flushed. "Idle gossip. The poor woman was lonely. I merely offered companionship. I suppose that's to be condemned now." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "Loneliness does drive people into curious alliances, Colonel. I once knew a lady in Chipping Cleghorn who took up amateur dramatics purely to meet someone who would listen to her stories. Unfortunately, he turned out to be a burglar." The colonel blinked at her, uncertain whether to laugh or protest. Craddock cleared his throat. "You had no quarrel with Mrs. Carroway? No argument? No misunderstanding?" Harcourt hesitated. "There was a disagreement. She asked me for a loan, a rather large sum. I refused, naturally. She was angry. Said she'd tell the whole village I'd made advances to her. Damnable lie, of course, but, well, you can imagine the embarrassment." "That was the day before the festival?" Craddock asked. "Yes, but I'd no reason to harm her, Inspector. None at all." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "And yet pride, dear Colonel, has caused many uncharacteristic actions. Still, I believe you when you say you didn't mean her harm. You see, your voice just now, when you spoke of her, carried sorrow, not hatred." The colonel stared at her in astonishment. "You can tell that from a man's voice? One learns," she said simply. Outside, as they walked back through the crisp afternoon air, Craddock frowned. "You don't believe he did it?" "No," Miss Marple said. "He's too transparent. A man like Colonel Harcourt could no more hide a murder than a child could hide a stolen apple. His guilt is of a different nature, emotional, perhaps moral, but not criminal." "Then who?" She smiled faintly. "That is the question, isn't it? Simon Darnley is clever but too self-assured. Mrs. Pembroke is fussy but harmless. Yet there was one detail that troubles me greatly." "What's that?" "The missing glove," she said. Craddock blinked. "Glove?" "Yes." When the constable found the handbag, he mentioned one damp kid glove beside it. Only one. A lady does not mislay half her pair without noticing. Unless, of course, someone else dropped it deliberately to suggest haste or distress. That, Inspector, feels like stagecraft, not despair. That evening the village gathered in subdued clusters at the Blue Boar. Conversation was cautious now. The fun of speculation had waned under the shadow of real fear. Mrs. Hartnell, ever indignant, announced, "It's obvious who did it." "That cousin of hers, what was his name?" "Darnley. I always said he looked slippery. You mark my words. It's the quiet ones you have to watch." "Rubbish," said Mr. Denby. "If anyone's to blame, it's the Colonel. Men of his age lose their heads over a pretty face. Seen it before." Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting, looked up mildly. "It's curious," she said. "Everyone assumes love or money must be at the bottom of a thing like this. Yet sometimes one finds motives of a more social variety." Mrs. Hartnell sniffed. "Social variety? Oh yes, a certain embarrassment, for instance. Or a secret one fears might be told. I once knew a maid who poisoned her mistress, simply because the lady discovered she had been corresponding with a footman. Pride, you see. It's as dangerous as greed." The room went silent for a heartbeat. Then murmurs began again, lower, more cautious. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles flashing like twin silver winks in the lamplight. Back at the vicarage, Craddock was going through the late Mrs. Carroway's notebook. Lists of expenses, he said. Payments to various people, dressmakers, jewelers, and a few to someone named H. Large sums, too. Miss Marple leaned over. Ah, yes, H. That would explain a good deal. Craddock raised an eyebrow. You know who it is? Oh, I have my suspicions, she said softly. But one must never rush these things. People reveal themselves in the most inconvenient ways when they think they're safe. She glanced at the page again. Still, the letter H does seem rather too convenient, doesn't it? Almost as though it were meant to be found. Craddock looked at her sharply. You think someone planted it? Miss Marple smiled. I think, Inspector, that we are being led. And whoever leads us wants us to believe the Colonel guilty, which, of course, suggests quite the opposite. When she returned home that night, the snow had ceased, and the moon lay coldly bright over the fields. Miss Marple paused at her gate, looking toward the distant lights of the mill house once more. She had seen the same kind of performance many times. A trail of clues too perfect, too convenient, as though written by someone who enjoyed playing at crime. And she wondered, who in St. Mildred's had the mind for such a performance? Inside, she set aside her knitting and wrote a short note to Inspector Craddock. Dear Inspector, do be cautious about accepting the obvious. The person who most desires to appear innocent often arranges the neatest appearances of guilt. Yours sincerely, Jane Marple. She folded the letter neatly, placed it beside the clock, and allowed herself a rare sigh. The first suspect, she thought, was almost always the wrong one. The following day dawned crisp and bright, the snow glittering like powdered glass beneath a pale sun. St. Mildred's, outwardly peaceful once more, hummed beneath its calm surface with tension and curiosity. The church bell chimed 8, and by past, every breakfast table in the village was alive with speculation. But while tongues wagged and theories multiplied, Miss Marple was not at home. She was walking briskly toward the mill house, her sensible boots crunching on the frost, and her blue eyes bright with thought. Inspector Craddock had granted her permission to have a look around, a phrase that, in Miss Marple's hands, carried far more significance than it did for most. Simon Darnley answered the door, looking less polished than usual. His tie was askew, and faint shadows marked the corners of his eyes. Miss Marple, he said, forcing a polite smile. To what do I owe this visit? Oh, merely curiosity, she said lightly. One so seldom has the opportunity to see a house like this up close. Such a fine example of late Georgian symmetry, and your cousin had such taste, so modern, and yet with touches of the past. May I? He hesitated, then stepped aside. Of course, though I must warn you, the place is a bit in disarray. Miss Marple entered the drawing-room, her gaze sweeping the elegant but slightly untidy surroundings. The faint scent of lilies masking something sharper. The fireplace cold and unused, and on the mantel, a small framed photograph of a smiling man in uniform. Her late husband, I presume? She asked. Darnley nodded. Yes, Major Carroway, killed in a hunting accident some years ago. Miss Marple looked closer. So handsome. He has the look of a man who enjoyed taking risks, don't you think? Darnley frowned. I wouldn't know. Oh, but you do, Mr. Darnley, she said pleasantly. You have the same eyes. People who thrive on uncertainty always do. My late nephew Raymond had them too, though in his case it was the stock exchange, rather than horses, that proved his downfall. He forced a thin smile. I suppose you've come to see if I poisoned my cousin. Good gracious, no, said Miss Marple with a faint laugh. I leave such determinations to the authorities. I am far more interested in why people do what they do than in how they do it. She bent to examine a small-end table beside the sofa. On it lay a half-empty packet of letters, some bound neatly with ribbon, others loose and hastily folded. Her fingers hovered delicately above them. "May I?" Darnley shrugged. "If you like. They're mostly bills and invitations." She sifted lightly through the stack. Invitations to tea, charity bazaars, a few letters from London shops. But one envelope caught her eye, a plain, unadorned one, the paper of poorer quality. It was addressed simply to L. Carroway, Mill House, St. Mildred's, in a masculine scrawl. There was no return address. The letter inside was brief. "I must see you before the festival. You promised you would not do this. If you go through with it, everything will come out. Think of what it would mean for both of us." As Miss Marple folded the note carefully, her expression unreadable. "Most curious?" she murmured. "Did you know about this, Mr. Darnley?" He shook his head. "No, I've never seen it before." Perhaps she meant to destroy it and changed her mind. It's so easy to forget small things in a house this size. Her eyes flicked to the hearth. A scattering of ashes still rested in the grate, gray and undisturbed. "Would you mind if I borrowed a little dustpan? I dislike seeing untidiness in a drawing room." He hesitated again, but fetched it from the kitchen. By the time he returned, Miss Marple was standing very still, her gaze fixed on the rug before the fireplace. There, half hidden in the pile, lay a small charred scrap of cloth. She lifted it gently. The faint pattern of embroidery, an initial perhaps, was still visible. The letter H, stitched in gold. She said softly, "How neat. Our friend H again." An hour later, Miss Marple sat opposite Inspector Craddock at the vicarage. The charred scrap rested in a paper envelope before him. She found it by the fireplace. Constable Simmons explained. "Looks like it was part of a handkerchief, or glove lining." Craddock frowned. "You think it belonged to the victim?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No. Mrs. Carroway preferred perfume and lace, not embroidered linen. This belongs to a man. The stitching is firm, the monogram bold. It suggests confidence, even vanity. And you believe this H is connected to the note?" "I do. And I believe whoever H is, he was here recently, perhaps even the morning of the festival. He tried to burn something, but not completely, which makes one wonder what it was that troubled him so." Craddock leaned back, thoughtful. "Colonel Harcourt's first initial is H." "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly, "but that, you see, is the problem. It's too obvious. A clever person, especially one with a theatrical sense, would use that very fact to misdirect, to frame a man already halfway condemned by rumor." Craddock rubbed his chin. "Then who else could H be?" "There are many possibilities," said Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling faintly. "Names beginning with H abound. Harriet Pembroke, for instance, or Dr. Latham's first name. Harold, I believe. People often overlook the quiet ones, and yet quiet people can be quite desperate when cornered." "Desperate for what?" "For peace, perhaps, or silence." That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Dr. Latham's house under the pretense of bringing marmalade. Mrs. Latham, a nervous little woman with anxious hands, greeted her in the sitting room. "So dreadful, Miss Marple," she said, twisting a handkerchief. "Poor Lydia. Though between you and me, she was not, well, not the sort of lady I'd have invited to tea." Miss Marple smiled sympathetically. "Oh, I'm sure she meant no harm. She simply enjoyed attention." Mrs. Latham's lips thinned. She enjoyed far too much of it. From my husband, for one. Miss Marple's expression was serene. Men are sometimes flattered by admiration, my dear, especially when they feel a little overlooked at home. But admiration is not the same as affection. Mrs. Latham looked at her sharply. You think I had anything to do with her death? Good heavens, no, said Miss Marple. But I do think you knew something you've not yet told the inspector. Perhaps about a letter. The woman hesitated. I found one in my husband's coat pocket, days before the festival, from Mrs. Carroway. It said only, I can't keep your secret any longer. Have I asked him about it? He said it was nonsense, that she was only being dramatic. I burned it. Miss Marple nodded slowly. I see. And your husband, he keeps his prescriptions here, does he not? Laudanum and such. Yes, Mrs. Latham said faintly. He's had it for years, strictly for medical use, of course. Of course, said Miss Marple, rising. Thank you, my dear. I believe you've been most helpful. That evening, as twilight deepened over the snow-covered roofs, Miss Marple sat by her window, the day's discoveries turning over in her mind. The letter from H.H., the charred scrap embroidered with the same initial, the doctor's wife, burning evidence in fear rather than malice, the colonel's too obvious guilt, and one other thing, an almost imperceptible detail that had lodged in her mind since the festival itself, the punch bowl. She recalled clearly how Mrs. Pembroke had fussed over the decorations, how she'd insisted on adding a sprig of mistletoe above the table, how she'd borrowed a silver ladle from the church vestry. But when Miss Marple had seen the bowl after the tragedy, there had been 2 ladles, one silver, one glass, a substitution, unnoticed in the confusion. She rose, her joints protesting faintly, and made a note in her diary. 2 ladles, one borrowed, one not. Find out who brought the second. Then she smiled, a small, satisfied smile. Murderers, she reflected, were often undone not by what they did, but by what they forgot. The days following the discovery of the monogrammed cloth brought an uneasy thaw to St. Mildred's. Icicles loosened and plopped into the gutters. Snow slipped from the church roof with soft sighs, but the air of suspicion did not melt with the frost. It only thickened, clinging to the village like damp mist. Miss Marple, outwardly serene, was quietly arranging a few primroses in a small glass vase when Inspector Craddock called again at her cottage. He looked harassed and slightly chilled. I thought you might like an update, Miss Marple, he said, accepting the cup of tea she pressed into his hands. We've confirmed the glove fragment came from a man's handkerchief. Linen, fine quality, stitched locally. There's a shop in Eastbourne that does monogramming of that sort, and they're checking their records. How efficient, said Miss Marple mildly, though one should never underestimate the cleverness of the domestic needle. I once knew a charwoman who could reproduce any monogram she saw, purely for amusement. Still, every stitch has its story. Craddock sighed. The colonel is still the prime suspect. The more we learn, the worse it looks. There's proof he withdrew a large sum in cash a day before the murder, the same amount Mrs. Carroway owed to several people. If she'd threatened to expose him, that might have been motive enough. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It might. But as I said before, the obvious is seldom the truth. Tell me, Inspector, have you found who brought the second ladle to the punch bowl? Craddock looked puzzled. The second. Oh yes, Constable Simmons traced it. Belonged to Mrs. Pembroke. She said she lent it when she saw the vicar's one was chipped. Why? Oh, no reason. Miss Marple said sweetly. Only it is such an odd thing to carry to a snow festival, unless one had intended from the start to be near the punch. Craddock frowned. You don't suspect the vicar's wife? My dear Inspector, said Miss Marple, I suspect everyone equally. It is far the safest policy. That afternoon, the village hall was the scene of what Mrs. Hartnell later described as the greatest social explosion since the Women's Institute jam dispute. Inspector Craddock had requested the attendance of several villagers for what he termed a few clarifications. In a place like St. Mildred's, that meant half the village turned up. Miss Marple, seated discreetly in the back row with her knitting, looked more like an amiable chaperone than a detective observer. The first to be questioned was Mrs. Pembroke. She arrived flustered, cheeks pink from the cold and from indignation. I really think, Inspector, she began, that to drag one into official inquiries is hardly necessary. Everyone knows my ladle was purely a matter of convenience. The vicar's was dreadfully chipped, and one wants things to look nice for the parish, doesn't one? Indeed, Craddock said calmly. And you kept the ladle afterward? Of course not. I left it by the refreshment table. Anyone might have picked it up. Miss Marple's needles paused for an instant. Did you wash it first, my dear? She asked, in her soft voice. Wash it? Certainly not. I had no time. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. Then the residue of the punch would still have been there. Mrs. Pembroke's lips tightened. If you're suggesting— Not at all, said Miss Marple, smiling kindly. It's only that sometimes people handle things carelessly, and fingerprints are such persistent little creatures. The remark silenced the room. Mrs. Pembroke's eyes darted toward her husband, who looked alarmed but said nothing. Next came Dr. Villon Latham. He appeared composed, though his wife, waiting nervously near the door, was pale as linen. Doctor, Craddock began, you confirmed the poison was laudanum mixed with strychnine. Did you keep both substances in your surgery? I did, said Latham. The laudanum as a sedative, the strychnine as a tonic for certain heart cases. Both under lock and key. And the keys in my waistcoat pocket, always. Except perhaps during the festival? Miss Marple suggested gently. You were busy then, Doctor, were you not? Attending to Mrs. Pembroke's fainting spell? He glanced at her sharply. Yes, but my wife was with me. The surgery door was locked. Indeed, said Miss Marple. Such a comfort to have a wife who is watchful. Mrs. Latham flinched, though only Miss Marple seemed to notice. When Simon Darnley's turn came, he sauntered in with a kind of practiced nonchalance. Still trying to make a villain of me, Inspector? He asked, flashing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We're simply gathering facts, Craddock replied. For instance, you mentioned your cousin was planning a trip abroad. Can you confirm that? She mentioned it, said Darnley. Paris first, then somewhere warmer. She said she needed a change. Miss Marple looked up. Did she say when she intended to leave? Right after the New Year. How interesting, Miss Marple said quietly. Then her death saved someone a great inconvenience, didn't it? Darnley's smile faltered. I don't know what you mean. Oh, nothing in particular, she said, returning to her knitting. Only, I imagine she would have required funds for such a trip, and perhaps she might have drawn upon her accounts, or even sold certain securities. If another person depended on her generosity, that departure might have seemed most alarming. Darnley opened his mouth, then closed it again. When the questioning ended, the villagers dispersed in uneasy silence. Miss Marple remained seated, packing away her knitting. Inspector Craddock came over, rubbing the back of his neck. "You've unsettled them, you know." "Oh dear," she said. "People dislike being reminded that truth seldom hides far away. It's usually just under one's nose, rather like dust one pretends not to see." "What do you think of them, honestly?" "I think," she replied, "that each conceals something, though not all conceal murder." She looked toward the door where Mrs. Latham had stood, her face pale and strained. That poor woman, for instance, she hides guilt, but not her own. That evening, Miss Marple went to the church for choir practice. She did not sing, her voice was frail, but she enjoyed the quiet company. The vicar, kind but distracted, thanked her for coming. The pews were chilly, and the candles smoked faintly, sending tiny threads of soot into the air. Halfway through a carol, she noticed Mrs. Pembroke whispering urgently to Mrs. Hartnell near the vestry. The two women's heads bent close. Their faces were tense, conspiratorial. When the practice ended, they departed quickly together, not noticing Miss Marple's watchful gaze. Outside, snow began again, a fine dust falling through the lamplight. Miss Marple followed the two women at a discreet distance, her small figure nearly lost in the drift. They turned toward the lane that led to the mill house. "Foolish," Miss Marple murmured. "If one means to keep a secret, one shouldn't discuss it in the open." From a bend in the hedge, she saw Mrs. Hartnell hand Mrs. Pembroke a small parcel. Words drifted on the wind. "Burn it tonight. No one must know." When they parted, Miss Marple waited until the lamps faded in the distance, then approached the spot where they had stood. In the snow lay a scrap of brown paper, torn from the parcel. Written in neat black ink were the words, "Prescription copy. Keep confidential." She folded it carefully and placed it in her handbag. "So," she whispered, "the doctor's hand after all. But whose will guided it?" For the next morning brought new scandal. Word spread that Mrs. Pembroke had fallen ill. Nothing fatal, just a violent sickness after supper. The doctor claimed tainted preserves, but half the village swore divine punishment had visited her for knowing too much. Miss Marple called that afternoon, bringing a basket of broth. Mrs. Pembroke was pale but indignant. "Honestly, Jane, the talk in this village, you'd think I were a criminal." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle. "People do chatter, my dear, sometimes from fear. It makes them feel safe to imagine guilt elsewhere." Mrs. Pembroke looked away. "I only tried to help. Dr. Latham asked me to dispose of some papers. He said they were old prescriptions, not needed. I burned them last night." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "And did he happen to mention whose prescriptions they were?" Mrs. Pembroke hesitated. "Mrs. Carroway's, of course." Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes gleamed. "And you burned them after he visited you, I suppose?" "Yes, he came round about 6. Very agitated, said the village was gossiping about him, and that it was best to clear away anything that might be misinterpreted." "Most sensible of him," Miss Marple said, though one wonders why he feared misinterpretation, unless there was something to interpret. Mrs. Pembroke's lips parted, then pressed shut again. "You don't think—" "I think, my dear," said Miss Marple, rising, "that the good doctor has been rather less than truthful, and that the truth is about to grow too heavy for him to carry alone." Outside, the snow had ceased. Miss Marple walked slowly toward home, the cold air stinging her cheeks, her mind quietly assembling the mosaic of deceit. The pattern was clearer now. A doctor afraid of exposure, a wife desperate to protect him, a vicar's wife unwittingly his accomplice. But still, one piece was missing, the link that bound the poison to the glass. And then, as she reached her gate, she saw it as plainly as the silver trail of a snail upon a garden path. The second ladle, borrowed but not washed, had gone from Mrs. Pembroke's kitchen to the surgery and back again, carrying within it the faintest residue of medicine. She smiled, a small sorrowful smile. "Ah," she murmured, "so it was kindness, misplaced kindness, that killed her. How terribly human." Morning came to St. Mildred's, wrapped in a soft white mist. The snow that had gleamed so brilliantly days before now lay dulled and heavy. The once picturesque drifts turned to slush, yet the village seemed to hold its breath, as though awaiting some further calamity. Miss Marple, however, rose as she always did, at 7 sharp, a cup of weak tea beside her, and her knitting basket by her chair. She was halfway through turning the heel of a sock when a sharp rap at the door startled her needles. It was Constable Simmons, looking anxious and flushed. "Miss Marple, ma'am. Terrible business this morning. Dr. Latham's been found dead in his surgery." "Dear me," she said quietly, setting aside her knitting. "How very sudden. Was it—" "Natural causes." The young constable hesitated. "Inspector Craddock says we can't be sure. Looks like poison. Same as Mrs. Carroway." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Ah, the poisoner poisoned. How dreadfully symmetrical. It always makes one think of those unfortunate Greek tragedies." She fetched her coat and hat without fuss. "I think, Constable, we had better take a little walk. There are times when familiarity with the domestic scene proves surprisingly useful." The surgery stood at the far end of the high street, a neat brick building with lace curtains drawn across its front windows. Inside, the air was thick with disinfectant and something sweeter, chloroform, perhaps, or the residue of medicine. Inspector Craddock stood by the desk, his expression grim. "You can tell your stories later, Simmons," he said, then looked up at Miss Marple with a sigh. "Yes, I thought you'd appear." "Appearances, dear Inspector, are one's duty when one's conscience feels piqued," she said mildly. Dr. Latham lay slumped over his desk, his spectacles askew. On the blotter before him was a half-written note, the pen fallen from his hand. Craddock handed Miss Marple a folded paper. "He left this. Seems to be a confession." The note read, "I cannot endure the disgrace. I meant only to quiet her, not to kill. My wife knew nothing. May God forgive me." Miss Marple read it twice, then placed it gently back. "So neat," she murmured. "Almost too neat. He meant to quiet her, did he? One wonders in what sense." "You think it's false?" Craddock asked. "I think," she replied, "that when a man takes poison, he seldom writes so tidy a note. The hand trembles, the ink blots, and yet here every word is measured, the penmanship steady to the end. Don't you find that curious?" Craddock frowned. "Are you saying someone else wrote it?" "Perhaps," she said softly. "Or perhaps someone held his hand while he did." While the inspector questioned Mrs. Latham, pale, trembling, and tearful, Miss Marple wandered quietly through the small surgery. She noted the tidy arrangement of bottles, the drawers labeled in neat handwriting, and the absence of dust anywhere except on one shelf. That shelf held only a single object, a small china cup with a painted sprig of violets. Miss Marple tilted her head. How very pretty, and how very out of place. She lifted it carefully. A faint scent of bitter almonds clung to the rim. "Strychnine rarely smells so," she murmured, "but cyanide does." She turned toward Craddock. "Inspector, did you happen to test for more than one poison?" He blinked. "No, we assumed it was the same as before." "Ah," said Miss Marple, replacing the cup. "Then I fear your assumption may have been most helpful to the murderer." By noon, The village was abuzz once more. Another death. The doctor himself, Mrs. Hartnell, declared it was divine justice, while Mrs. Pembroke, still won from her illness, insisted through tears that Dr. Latham had been driven to despair by cruel gossip. Miss Marple took tea with the vicar that afternoon, and their conversation, though outwardly benign, danced delicately around the topic. "Such a tragedy, Miss Marple," the vicar sighed, "to think that sin and death could find such easy purchase in our peaceful parish." "My dear Mr. Pembroke," she said gently, "peace is never so fragile as in a place where everyone knows everyone else's business." He nodded ruefully. "My wife's beside herself. She insists she saw Dr. Latham only last night, after choir practice." "He seemed quite normal." "Oh," said Miss Marple. "Did he say why he called?" "Something about returning a borrowed ladle, I believe. He left it at the kitchen door." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. "Returned, did he? That is most interesting. And did your wife wash it afterward?" I don't know. Why?" "Oh, no reason," she said mildly. "Only I should hate to think she used it again before it was properly cleaned." That evening, as twilight crept across the snowy rooftops, Miss Marple made her way once more to the mill house. The windows were dark, the shutters closed. Only Simon Darnley was there, pacing the drawing-room. "Miss Marple," he said tensely, "I suppose you've come to accuse me next." "Accuse?" she repeated with gentle astonishment. "Why, Mr. Darnley, I never accuse. I merely observe." He gave a short laugh, then observed this. "The village has gone mad. The colonel's still under suspicion, the doctor's dead, and I'm the convenient black sheep. You should hear what they're saying, that I'm the real killer, that Lydia was blackmailing me over something in London. Utter rot. And yet," said Miss Marple softly, "you did spend a great deal of time in London, didn't you? And Mrs. Carroway did receive several letters from there, letters which you conveniently destroyed." His face darkened. "She had no right to those letters. They weren't hers. Oh, but you see, my dear Mr. Darnley, she was very fond of things that weren't hers. It's an unfortunate trait that sometimes ends very badly." He turned away, gripping the mantelpiece. "You think you know everything, don't you? Well, you don't. Lydia wasn't blackmailing me. She was blackmailing him, the doctor. She found out he'd been altering prescriptions, diluting medicines, pocketing the difference. That's why he was desperate to silence her." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And yet now the doctor himself is silenced. How very convenient." His shoulders sagged. "Do you think I killed him too?" "I think," she said quietly, "that someone killed him to make his confession seem genuine. And you are clever enough to have seen the opportunity. But cleverness and guilt do not always walk hand in hand. Sometimes fear does." He turned sharply. "Fear?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Fear of exposure. Fear of losing something, perhaps someone, you care for more than you dare admit." For a moment his expression faltered. Then he said almost inaudibly, "You think I cared for her?" Miss Marple met his gaze gently. "I think you cared enough to let her destroy you, if it came to that. But someone else did not share that devotion." Later that night, Miss Marple returned home and sat long by the fire, her teacup cooling beside her. The pattern was forming clearly now, each piece slotting neatly into place. Mrs. Carroway's death by laudanum and strychnine. A forged confession, conveniently absolving others. A second poisoning, different substance, same result. The borrowed ladle passed from hand to hand like a silent courier, and at the center of it all, one person who had moved quietly among them, invisible yet always near, smoothing over gossip, comforting the anxious, binding the village together with tea, sympathy, and whispered advice. Miss Marple rose and went to her writing desk. On a small sheet of notepaper she wrote a single name. Then she folded it neatly and slipped it into her pocket. "Tomorrow," she said aloud, "we shall see how people behave when faced with their own reflection. It tells one far more than any confession." The following morning, Miss Marple invited several villagers to tea. Inspector Craddock, the vicar and his wife, Mrs. Pembroke, and Simon Darnley. The sitting room at the parsonage cottage was warm and bright, the air scented faintly with orange peel and cinnamon. She poured tea, smiling kindly as the company settled. "I thought," she said, "we might have a little gathering. So much unpleasantness of late. It does one good to restore a sense of community." Mrs. Pembroke smiled weakly. "How thoughtful of you, Miss Marple." "Not at all, my dear. Oh, and Inspector, would you be so good as to fetch the ladle from your coat pocket? I believe you've been holding it for safekeeping." Craddock frowned, but obeyed. "Here it is. We cleaned it, of course." "Ah, splendid," said Miss Marple. "Then perhaps each of you might take a turn admiring it. Such workmanship, don't you agree?" The ladle passed from hand to hand. When it reached Mrs. Pembroke, her fingers trembled slightly. "Careful, my dear," Miss Marple said softly. "It does bring back memories, doesn't it? The snow festival, the punch, the borrowed utensil that went from your kitchen to the doctor's and back again. One wonders what residue clung to it that night." Mrs. Pembroke froze. I don't understand." "Oh, I think you do," said Miss Marple gently. "You meant only to help him, didn't you? A simple favor for a friend. You lent the ladle again last night, just as you did before. Only this time, he drank from it himself." The color drained from Mrs. Pembroke's face. "No, I didn't. He said it was medicine. He said it would make everything right." The room fell silent. Miss Marple sighed. "Poor dear. You see, Inspector, the good doctor's conscience wasn't nearly as guilty as his wife believed. But hers was. She wrote the note. She mixed the poison. And she handed him the cup. With love, no doubt." The confession, or what might better be termed the unraveling, of Mrs. Pembroke had left St. Mildred's in that peculiar state of moral vertigo which follows any scandal among respectable people. The villagers did not know whether to pity or despise her. Some claimed she had been misled by the late Dr. Latham. Others whispered that she was as sly as a cat with cream on its whiskers. Inspector Craddock, meanwhile, was not satisfied. "She admits giving him the cup," he told Miss Marple that evening, pacing before the fire in her small sitting room. "But she insists she didn't know what was in it. Says the doctor himself poured the medicine." Miss Marple poured another cup of tea for him, her manner as serene as ever. "Confession, my dear Inspector, is a most deceptive thing. The innocent may confess from guilt, and the guilty may protest from innocence. The real question is, what did she hope would happen when she gave him that cup? She says she thought it would calm him." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Indeed, how thoughtful. But I fear the doctor's peace was not the sort that comes from tonics." Craddock looked weary. "Then what's your theory now?" "Oh, not a theory," she said, "merely an intuition. But before we proceed further, I think I should like to give our dear Mrs. Pembroke a little opportunity. To rest, of course, and to speak truth if she chooses. I find people reveal far more when they believe themselves quite safe." Craddock frowned. "You mean a trap?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "A test, Inspector. One must never call it a trap. It sounds so vulgar." 2 days later, the vicarage drawing-room hosted an afternoon gathering of extraordinary politeness. The pretext was a charity planning committee for next month's Spring Thaw Bazaar. But everyone present knew that it was in fact a careful staging arranged by Miss Marple. Present were Mrs. Pembroke, pale and subdued in lavender, Colonel Harcourt, looking profoundly uncomfortable, Simon Darnley, who sat apart with a morose air, and Mrs. Hartnell, who, being both incorrigibly curious and possessed of a new fox fur collar, had insisted on attending. Inspector Craddock sat quietly in a corner, disguised, though hardly convincingly, as a parish records volunteer. Miss Marple presided at the tea table. Her lace cap was a little askew, her manner grandmotherly, her mind keen as a scalpel. "It is so pleasant," she said, in her mildest tone, "to meet together after all the recent sadness. A village, you know, is rather like a piece of embroidery, so easily frayed if one pulls a single thread too sharply." No one spoke. The only sound was the tick of the vicarage clock. "Still," she continued, "one must mend what has been torn, and perhaps today we might do a little mending." She poured tea for each, her movements unhurried, her eyes alert. Then she turned to Mrs. Pembroke. "My dear, I do so hope you are feeling stronger. It must have been dreadful, discovering that poor Dr. Latham's medicine was, how shall we say, ill-chosen." Mrs. Pembroke's hands trembled slightly on the teacup. "Yes, dreadful," she murmured. "I still cannot think how such a thing could have happened." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is strange, is it not, how easily one can mistake one bottle for another. Laudanum, chloroform, sacionide, they all have such confusing labels, unless, of course, one writes the label oneself." A faint gasp escaped Mrs. Hartnell. Simon Darnley leaned forward, but Miss Marple continued serenely. "Though to be fair," she added, "I do not think the true author of our misfortunes ever intended both deaths. The first, perhaps, yes, but the second was merely the consequence of a mind too clever for its own conscience." Colonel Harcourt cleared his throat. "Forgive me, Miss Marple, but I'm not sure I follow. Are you saying Dr. Latham didn't kill Mrs. Carroway?" "Not directly," said Miss Marple. "He supplied the means, perhaps even the opportunity, but the decision, the deliberate mixing of laudanum and strychnine in that punch, was not his. It was someone far nearer the scene, someone who fancied themselves the guardian of village propriety." Her gaze rested on Mrs. Pembroke, who shrank in her chair. "No," cried Mrs. Pembroke suddenly. "I swear to you I didn't mean her harm. I only wanted to stop her, to stop the talk about my husband and her. He said she would ruin him, ruin the parish. And so," Miss Marple said softly, "you slipped into the church kitchen before the festival began. You took the small bottle from your husband's study, the one marked tonic, and you poured just a few drops into the punch bowl. Enough, you thought, to make her ill, not dead. Am I right?" Tears welled in the woman's eyes. "I only wanted to make her faint, to frighten her into silence. And afterward," Miss Marple continued, "you told the doctor what you had done. He panicked, of course. He knew what that tonic contained. You both agreed to keep quiet. But when she died, he realized the poison could be traced. So he forged prescriptions, destroyed evidence, and when suspicion drew near, he began to drink himself into despair. You saw it, and feared he might confess. That, my dear, is why you mixed his medicine last week." Mrs. Pembroke's breath came in short gasps. "He asked for it himself. He said he couldn't go on living with the guilt." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "but you poured it, and you wrote his note, didn't you, with your tidy hand, the one the parish accounts know so well. May God forgive me." It sounded convincing, because you believed he would. Silence fell, thick and absolute. The clock struck 4. Inspector Craddock rose quietly, but Miss Marple lifted a hand. "Not yet, Inspector. You see, there is still one truth remaining. The reason why Mrs. Carroway's little scandal mattered so very much." She turned toward Simon Darnley, who had gone pale. "You, Mr. Darnley, know it best. She threatened to expose Dr. Latham not for financial gain, but for affection. She was in love with him, wasn't she? She wanted him to leave his wife. Darnley swallowed hard. Yes, as she told me. Said she'd free him if he wouldn't free himself. Mrs. Pembroke gave a choked cry. That woman. She would have destroyed everything. My husband, the parish, our reputation, everything sacred. I couldn't let her. Miss Marple nodded sadly. And so you played God. But you see, Mrs. Pembroke, murder seldom ends as one plans. It multiplies, like gossip. The vicar's wife collapsed into tears. The vicar himself, white-faced, placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. "My dear, why did you not tell me? I thought you'd despise me," she sobbed. "I only wanted to protect you, to protect us all." Miss Marple reached out and patted her hand. "We women, my dear, are often too ready to protect others from their own folly. But truth has a way of protecting itself." Inspector Craddock cleared his throat gently. "I think that's all for now." He led the weeping woman away, her husband following in silence. When they had gone, Miss Marple poured fresh tea for the remaining guests. "I always find," she said mildly, "that people speak most honestly after the worst has already happened." Colonel Harcourt stared into his cup. "You saw all this. How?" "Oh, one notices things," she replied. "For instance, Mrs. Pembroke's habit of touching her throat when certain names were mentioned. Her tendency to rearrange objects she feels guilty about. When she handled the ladle, her fingers lingered on the handle a moment too long, like a child touching a forbidden toy." Simon Darnley gave a low whistle. "So it was her all along. Not the doctor, not me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Human nature, my dear Mr. Darnley, is seldom tidy. We like to think villains look the part, but crime is often committed by those who iron their napkins and remember everyone's birthdays." He gave a strained laugh. "You make it sound almost inevitable." "Not inevitable," she corrected. "Only predictable. There is a world of difference." That evening, as darkness settled over St. Mildred's, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the village once more hushed beneath a new fall of snow. Outside, the church bell tolled softly, calling the faithful to prayer. She gazed into the flames, reflecting not on triumph, but on sorrow. Murder, she knew, was never a matter of villainy alone. It was a symptom of fear, of love, of pride, bruised beyond endurance. She thought of Mrs. Pembroke, so prim and self-sacrificing, undone by her own sense of righteousness. Of poor Dr. Latham, too weak to face his own errors. Of Lydia Carroway, charming, heedless, and fatally meddlesome. And she thought, with quiet melancholy, that in every village there lay 100 small tragedies, each one capable of blooming into something monstrous if tended by silence and shame. Taking up her knitting once more, she murmured to herself, "Sin, like snow, always begins with something soft and beautiful. It's when it hardens that it kills." The day of the revelation dawned crisp and silver, with frost, painting the village hedgerows like delicate lace. St. Mildred's, despite its recent turmoil, was bustling with the gentle hum of village life. Shopkeepers arranged their wares with particular care. Children's boots crunched on the frost-hardened paths, and even the vicar's pigeons seemed to coo more nervously than usual, aware, perhaps, that something decisive was about to unfold. Miss Marple had arranged a meeting in the church hall, a neutral space that allowed all concerned parties to gather without suspicion. A sense of quiet anticipation clung to the air, mingling with the faint aroma of warming tea and wood smoke. She had invited Inspector Craddock, Mrs. Pembroke, Colonel Harcourt, Simon Darnley, Mrs. Hartnell, and the vicar and his wife. Each guest had been asked to arrive punctually and remain until the matter was concluded. As the last of the attendees shuffled in, Miss Marple stood at the front of the hall, her posture demure. her knitting basket tucked neatly at her side. The hall itself seemed to echo the gravity of the gathering. Benches creaked under shifting weight, and the small organ in the corner offered a silent witness to the scene. Miss Marple began with a gentle smile. "Thank you all for coming. I know that these past weeks have been troubling. A village, after all, is built on trust, and trust has been shaken in ways that I hope we may now mend. I ask for your patience while I recount what has transpired, though I must warn you, the truth is seldom simple." A hush fell over the hall, broken only by the soft tapping of Colonel Harcourt's cane against the wooden floor. Miss Marple continued. "It began, as you know, at the village snow festival. Mrs. Carroway's unfortunate death was, at first, an enigma, and naturally suspicion fell upon those nearby. The police did their work admirably, yet, as always, the human element eludes purely procedural scrutiny." She paused and looked around at the villagers. To understand a crime, one must first understand the hearts of those involved. People, good, decent people, can be driven to actions that appear monstrous, not from malice alone, but from fear, jealousy, or misguided devotion. She turned her gaze to Mrs. Pembroke, who now sat upright, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Pembroke, you have been troubled by this for some time. It is only natural. I hope you understand that nothing here is intended to shame, but rather to illuminate the truth." Mrs. Pembroke's lips trembled. I do not understand. I only wanted to protect—" Miss Marple raised a delicate finger. "Precisely. And that, my dear, is the beginning of the tale. You acted, as many do, out of protection. Yet the consequences were far graver than you imagined. Let us go, step by step." She gestured toward the hall's blackboard, which had been prepared earlier. On it were drawn rough sketches of the festival layout and the positions of each participant around the punch table. "You see," she said, "Mrs. Carroway was not merely a victim of circumstance. She was, perhaps unknowingly, a catalyst. Her intentions, though seemingly harmless, driven by a desire to reveal Dr. Latham's indiscretions, intersected tragically with human frailty. It is here that Mrs. Pembroke's actions become central." The villagers leaned forward, some whispering under their breath, others clutching each other's hands. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she continued. "Before the festival, you, Mrs. Pembroke, had discovered that Dr. Latham's medicines were potentially dangerous. You believed, quite reasonably, that Mrs. Carroway's interference could destroy not only your family's reputation, but also the fabric of the parish. Acting on impulse, you took the small tonic bottle from Dr. Latham's study without his knowledge, and added a portion to the festival punch, believing it would merely incapacitate her." Mrs. Pembroke's hands clenched. "I did. I only wanted to make her faint, to frighten her. Not—" Miss Marple nodded solemnly. "Yes, and the unintended consequence was death. That is the tragic reality of human error. But there is another layer, which complicates matters. The doctor, realizing the fatal potential of the tonic, attempted to cover the matter, fearing scandal. This is why you found the forged prescriptions and the destroyed notes. Efforts to conceal the truth, not commit it." Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "So the doctor didn't intend murder?" Miss Marple shook her head. "Not in the sense we usually consider. He was reckless, certainly, but not calculating in the way the heart can sometimes be. Human motives are rarely linear." Turning to Simon Darnley, she continued, "And you, Mr. Darnley, played your part unwittingly. Your friendship with Mrs. Carroway allowed her confidences to reach you. You were not complicit, but you too were a thread in this tangled weave." Simon's face went pale. "So, all along it was Mrs. Pembroke?" "Yes," said Miss Marple softly, "but not alone. She acted under the weight of fear and misplaced loyalty. in a moment where her judgment was clouded by the desire to protect those she loved. Yet, as always, truth finds a way. Mrs. Carroway's interference, her own ambition, and the doctor's weakness combined in a perfect storm of tragedy. Mrs. Hartnell, who had been fidgeting with her gloves, whispered, "But who is responsible, really? Who pays for all this?" Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Responsibility is a matter of perspective. Mrs. Pembroke will face the consequences of her actions, of course. But the village itself shares in this burden. We all allowed rumors, assumptions, and secret grievances to fester. We all, in small ways, contributed to the conditions in which this tragedy could occur." Colonel Harcourt, who had been silent, cleared his throat. "You make it sound almost moral rather than criminal." Miss Marple's eyes met his. "Crime is, above all, moral. The law enforces consequences, but understanding the why of it, that is the deeper work. In this village, we have learned that appearances can be deceiving, that a smile may hide fear, and that kindness can mask guilt. These lessons, though harsh, are necessary." She turned once more to Mrs. Pembroke. "You acted in a moment of desperation, yet you are not beyond redemption. Confession, when coupled with understanding, allows the heart to mend. The law will adjudicate, but the soul, my dear, is beyond measure." Inspector Craddock stepped forward. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I believe everything is now clear. We will take statements and proceed accordingly." Miss Marple nodded. "Of course, Inspector. It is a small mercy that truth, when illuminated carefully, spares as many as it condemns." A hush fell again, and the villagers sat in the quiet aftermath. Miss Marple's revelation had unwrapped every hidden motive, every subtle misstep, every human flaw that had contributed to the tragedy. Yet even as she spoke, there was no triumph in her voice, only a profound understanding of human nature, of the fragile balance between intention and consequence. Finally, she picked up her knitting once more. "And now, my friends," she said, "we must allow life to continue. Snow melts, festivals end, and the heart, though wounded, finds its own rhythm again. Remember that even in the smallest of villages, the consequences of our actions echo far beyond our sight." The villagers departed slowly, each lost in contemplation, leaving Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock alone in the quiet hall. "Well done, Miss Marple," Craddock said quietly. "You've tied together every loose thread. I confess I might never have seen it without you." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes reflecting the fading winter light through the frost-laced windows. "It is always a matter of observation, Inspector. The human heart reveals itself in the smallest of gestures, an anxious hand, a fleeting glance, a word spoken too softly. The rest is merely patience." She gathered her knitting and began to work in silence, while outside, the first snowflakes of a new winter began to drift lazily down, covering the village once more in a quiet, reflective peace. The village of St. Mildred's, though quiet once more, carried the subtle residue of its recent turmoil. The snow had fallen thick and steady overnight, blanketing the cottages, lanes, and hedgerows in a pristine white. To an unobservant eye, all appeared calm, picturesque even, as though nothing untoward had ever happened. But those who had witnessed the unraveling of events, the confessions, the whispered suspicions, the nervous glances exchanged in the village square, knew that beneath the surface, the community had been irrevocably changed. Miss Marple stepped out of her little house on the edge of the village, a steaming cup of tea in her hand, and surveyed the morning. Her eyes, sharp yet gentle, roamed over the quiet streets, the shuttered windows of cottages, and the delicate frost-laden fences. She had always felt that the village, like a tapestry, revealed its true patterns only when one paused long enough to observe. And in the past few weeks, those patterns had become painfully clear. Her neighbor, Mrs. Hartnell, was the first to appear, bustling along the snow-dusted lane, scarf wrapped tightly about her neck. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she called, her voice a little higher than usual, tinged with residual anxiety. It's quieter now, isn't it?" Miss Marple smiled softly. "Quiet, perhaps. But the village has a memory, Mrs. Hartnell. People will not forget what has transpired. It is part of their story now, woven in alongside the festivals, the teas, and the Sunday services." Mrs. Hartnell hesitated, then asked, "Do you think things will settle? I mean, really settle?" "They will," Miss Marple said, "but differently than before. There is always a new understanding when the truth is known, though it is seldom as comforting as one hopes. People will adjust, as they always do, but they will also carry with them the knowledge that appearances can be deceiving, and that trust, once shaken, requires care to rebuild." Across the street, the vicar emerged from his house carrying a small basket of bread for the birds. He nodded politely at Miss Marple. "Good morning, Miss Marple. It seems we have survived, though not unscathed." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Survival is rarely the same as innocence, Reverend. But there is opportunity in the aftermath to repair what can be repaired, and to guide the village toward a gentler equilibrium." In the center of the village, shopkeepers were reopening their doors, a little warier than usual. The baker, Mr. Fennel, arranged loaves in his window, casting furtive glances at the path leading to the church hall. The news of Mrs. Pembroke's confession had rippled through the community, and though few spoke openly, each carried their own mixture of relief, judgment, and lingering unease. At the same time, Colonel Harcourt made his way to the village square, his steps deliberate. He paused near the fountain, the snow glinting on its stone rim, and surveyed the scene. "One does not forget the human heart," he muttered to himself, his tone a mix of reflection and lingering discomfort. No matter how small the village, no matter how calm the surface, there is always a current of passion and fear below. Miss Marple, observing from the edge of the square, nodded quietly. She had known that the Colonel's words were truer than he might ever admit aloud. Human nature was, in her experience, as layered and unpredictable as the snowdrifts that now covered the village, and it was precisely that complexity that had allowed her to unravel the events of the snow festival with clarity and patience. Inside her cozy sitting room, later that morning, Miss Marple poured herself another cup of tea and settled into her favorite chair. Her cat, Tobias, wound around her ankles, purring softly, as if to provide reassurance that even amidst human folly, small comforts persisted. She reflected on the lessons of the past weeks. How fear could drive even the most upright villagers to desperate measures, how hidden resentments could fester unnoticed, and how the smallest observation, a glance, a hesitation, a misplaced word, could illuminate an entire web of secrets. The phone rang, breaking the quiet. It was Inspector Craddock, his tone brisk but courteous. "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you once more. I've filed the statements, and Mrs. Pembroke will be receiving the guidance and counsel she requires. The village seems to be adjusting, though, as you predicted, the memory of the events remains alive." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Thank you, Inspector. That is often the nature of things. The truth may set events in motion, but it does not erase what has been seen or felt. It simply allows understanding." After the call, Miss Marple donned her coat and walked toward the village hall. The hall, now cleared of benches and blackboards, seemed ordinary once more, yet the echoes of last week's gathering lingered. She paused for a moment and watched a pair of children rolling a snowball along the lane. Their laughter, innocent and unburdened, reminded her that life moved on, even when shadows lingered. At the same time, Mrs. Pembroke had returned to her cottage, under the careful watch of neighbors and the local constable. She had spent the previous days in reflection, acknowledging the gravity of her actions. Though remorse weighed heavily on her, Miss Marple knew that there was a path to redemption, through honesty, humility, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Meanwhile, gossip in the village had begun to shift from speculation to reflection. People whispered not only about the crime, but also about their own hidden impulses and unspoken grievances. Some carried guilt, some relief, and some a renewed caution. The dynamics of St. Mildred's, though seemingly unchanged, had subtly evolved, each villager now more aware of the fragility of appearances. Miss Marple returned home as the sun began to dip low, casting long shadows across the snowy lanes. She sat by the window knitting quietly, her thoughts serene yet vigilant. Tobias leapt onto her lap, settling comfortably. Outside, the wind stirred the snow gently, and the village exhaled, a collective sigh mingling with the winter air. She reflected, as she often did after resolving a mystery, that human nature was a puzzle more intricate than any crime scene. Motives were tangled, actions intertwined with fear and hope alike. And yet, with careful observation, patience, and empathy, clarity could be found. It was this understanding that gave her both comfort and purpose. Finally, as twilight fell over St. Mildred's, the village seemed, at least outwardly, to have returned to its gentle rhythm. Shop windows glimmered with candlelight, smoke curled from chimneys, and footsteps crunched over the freshly fallen snow. Beneath it all, life continued, resilient, complicated, and quietly enduring. Miss Marple sipped her tea and murmured to herself, "The heart of a village is not unlike its snow-covered lanes. The surface may appear smooth and even, but beneath lies depth, texture, and the traces of countless footsteps, each leaving a mark, each telling a story." And with that she resumed her knitting, the soft click of needles a comforting echo of order and calm in a world that was, as ever, both beautiful and complicated.